Dr. Joseph Accetta is Senior Executive Engineer / Scientist, that's what it says, with significant experience and broad technical background in engineering, research and development, spanning the military, national laboratory, aerospace, and industrial sectors. He holds a top secret Department of Defense clearance. He's been a career Air Force officer. He was on the board of directors in STIRP. When you see some of the slides that like Russ showed last night of the STIRP team in Turin, he's one of the people sitting around the planning meeting there.
Boy, is this going to be a paradigm shift. Thank you. I am Joe Accetta, not August Accetta, but you know, the gentleman out in California who has an exhibit and written a book. However, I will take credit if you insist. This paper is actually predicated on an assumption. Okay? And this is, in fact, a major paradigm shift from this conference. I understand from Joe that there's an award for the most heretical paper. And I'm not kidding. I'm going to make the assumption that the carbon-14 date is valid, and the historical coincide incidentally with the historical record.
Microphone.
And try to see how far this gets us in terms of extra 14th century technology. Can you hear me? Is that better? There we go. Okay. This one, all right. Now, you may hear some things in this talk that you haven't heard before, but I want to make a little remark that I was reminded of this morning. It had to do with what Ray Rogers, in one conversation that I had with Ray Rogers some time ago, he expressed some serious doubt about whether the carbon-14 dating could ever be done again because of contamination. Some of you may know that. And that's kind of a regrettable thing because, frankly, carbon-14 dating is kind of a milestone. It's a cornerstone, actually, in dating objects, and it's well accepted by the scientific community. Nevertheless, let me proceed. You've heard lots of history already, so I'm not going to bore you with going through this chronology. Of note in the context that I'm presenting here is that the first historical record is sometime around the 14th century, 1356, in the family of Ducharny in Lille, France. There is no record of where the shroud came from. The historical record is strangely silent. There's nothing in the record about how they obtained this. Now, there's also a letter from the Bishop of Troyes to the Pope declaring it a forgery due to an alleged confession of someone who actually claims to have created it. So those two things stand in support of the 14th century theses. And I realize there's controversy about everything probably that I'm going to say, but nevertheless, I'm going down this path, and it's a path of no return, and I want to see how far it goes. And in fact, it goes a little bit further than I originally suspected. What is of consequence on this one slide here is that the application of cotton patches, and it turns out cotton patches play a little bit of a role here as we go on. Lastly, and this has been talked about, there's no mention of an image in the gospel accounts at all. So these are kind of supportive facts in the context of the paper that I'm presenting. So in terms of the major visuals, I guess that's okay. In terms of the major visuals, we all know that there's very faint frontal and dorsal images of the crucified Christ. They contain quite a bit of detail regarding the crucifixion. There's marks resembling the Roman flagrum, crown of thorns, spears, and other wounds that you all have already heard about. These visual marks closely match, of course, the accounts of the crucifixion in the Gospels. Now, one anomaly that until very recently I was really perplexed about is the wounds in the wrists, not in the hands. Having traveled the world some in my later life, I've looked fairly consistently for images of Christ with the nails in the wrists and not the hands. And until recently, I've never been able to find one. Okay, so it seemed to be a singular representation of this wound. Now we know it's from the archaeological studies, we know from bones that have been unearthed that in fact this is the proper place. There is archaeological evidence for a crucified individual, and the wounds in fact were in the wrists between the radius and ulna here and not in the hands. The hands are incapable of supporting it. So say the pathologists. There's representations of blood stains on the cloth. It's been already talked about here in this conference that there are some components of real blood in those stains. There are cotton patches covering the burns from 15 to 37 fire. Now, my own personal observation, and by the way, I don't know if I said this, but I was on the team in 1978 that investigated the Shroud. I did the infrared spectroscopy and the infrared imaging. Looking at the cloth, this is a subjective observation on my part. The linen appears in remarkably good condition for being 2,000 years old, for example. And also another subjective observation is the blood stains don't look quite right. They're kind of pinkish. They're not representative, at least in my world, of blood stains. Not that I have a lot of rags laying around the house with old blood stains on them, but they don't look like them. Blood stains are, after a time, get quite dark brown. So the blood stains, in my subjective opinion, are rather odd. Now, the other thing that I will say with regard to this last bullet here, this linen appears in good condition. I recall 1978 wandering around in the basement of the Turin Museum of Archaeology, where for some reason the lights didn't work, and so we were wandering around in this basement, and there were several hundred mummies in this room, and we're looking at these mummies, and frankly, I did not see any case of mummy cloth looking anywhere near as good as the linen looks in the Shroud. Most of these mummies, in fact all of them that I saw, were wrapped, with strips rather than draped. And all the linen seemed to be pretty tattered. I acquired a couple of samples, linen samples from mummies from an individual, and looked at them. In fact, I even looked at them with Fourier transform spectrometer, and they all appeared quite tattered and very brown in color. So those are the major visuals. If you do a detailed visual examination, which some of you have, we've already talked about, there's presence of pollen from the Mideast. There's presence, now Walt McCrone, a microscopist back in 1970s or so, did a study of some of the threads taken from the cloth, and he claimed to have found hematite in the blood stains. Now hematite is a coloring agent. Now we know that the image lies on the very surface of the fibers. We know that the optical resolution is on the order of a few millimeters, depending on where you look. There's no evidence of pigments anywhere. It's all been said. And there's no evidence of brush strokes. And so, a major question arises as to where did this thing come from? Now, I guess we're not seeing the whole thing, but that's all right. There's no big surprises with respect to the multi-wavelength photography that was done in 1978. We didn't find any heavy metals characteristic of pigments. There is, and this turns out to be a pretty significant fact, there is a pervasive background of iron found on the cloth and inside the container. The infrared images that you see over here, whoops, wrong one, sorry about that. I just stole my thunder. There, okay. The infrared images here are pretty much consistent with the visible images. This is in the long-range region of the infrared. There was nothing remarkable revealed in the x-rays that were done on the entire cloth. There's no image, has already been talked about, there's no image on the backside of the cloth. The image is on the very top fibrils of the object. So, I already blew it, but anyways, the speculative theory. This is my theory to account for what we see in the 14th century. The Shroud image is likely the remnants of a 14th century block print, woodcut, however you want to use it. There's several terms to describe that, printed with iron gall ink. All right? Remnants is the operative word here. Now, why is this true? So these are the following attributes of a block print. Okay? Now, block print, let me describe that for a moment. It's just a large print made from a woodcut that's carved from a very shallow relief and inked and then printed on cloth. This was a common technique used in the 14th century and afterwards to print textiles. So the following things are actual attributes of these block prints. It's a high and reasonably consistent resolution. There is, in fact, a 3D-like property that stems from these block prints. If it's done in total frontal perspective, and if it's inked properly, you would expect, and I can't prove, but you would expect a sort of 3D-like property, because the image density is going to be proportional to the shallow relief. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. There are existing examples, and this is something that I discovered after looking through the literature. There are existing examples in both size and quality from that era, in the 14th and 15th centuries, of very large block prints. The image would appear, of course, with this technique as a photographic negative. The transfer of ink from very sharp places or places of high relief are going to be more dense than places of low relief. So you do get normally from this process something that might be called a photographic negative. There are no brushstrokes naturally in an object like this. And lastly, iron gall ink was in widespread use at the time. And one of the characteristics of iron gall ink is that it is corrosive, it is acidic. And I'll verify or I'll underscore this comment in a few seconds, in a few minutes. So there's some circumstantial issues that surround this as well that I want to talk about very briefly. And this is really quite interesting. George Burke, who some of you remember authored a series on TV called Connections, okay, talks about what happened after the Black Death in about 1347 in Europe. Because so many people died off, the survivors were enriched. Okay, they became wealthy. And there was a large demand for luxurious goods in Europe just after the Black Death. After all, you were the only survivor in the family, you inherited all the family's wealth. So that brought forth a demand for luxurious goods to satisfy that wealth, I guess. Now, the Champagne region in France, where we know the Shroud originated, at least historically, was a big trading center at that time. So it follows, at least circumstantially, that with a big demand for luxurious goods, a lot of stuff is flowing in and out of that region, and a lot of luxurious stuff. Now, Flanders, okay, nearby to the north, was a center for textile manufacturing using block printing techniques. Flanders is just up the road, actually, from Luray, just in northeast France. The wounds in the wrist, as I said earlier, are rare. Okay, I've never, in fact, until very recently, I never found any other rendition of Christ with wounds in the wrist, but there is another one. Okay, and I don't know how many of you have ever seen one elsewhere, but I'd be interested in hearing about it. It's another, I mentioned this already, it was pronounced a forgery stemming from an alleged confession. My view is that any of the optical characteristics that we see in the Shroud are not supported by any radiative theories, and I'll ramify that in a moment. So let me go into detail about some of the comments that I made earlier. This is a 15th century Roman engraving. It's very, very intricate and very detailed. The point here, and this, by the way, is in the Palace of the Doge's Museum in Venice, the point here is that the engraving art form, okay, was well developed even in the 15th century. So, the artistic, there's an artistic prelude to being able to create very finely detailed block prints. A second comment I'm going to make is linen is difficult to dye. These comments, and by the way, there is a formal paper on all the things that I'm saying here. These are excerpts, and all of these things are referenced. And this is a direct quote out of the literature. Due to the structural binding of cellulose and fibers, the pigments only adhere to the surface, and linen doesn't, will dye initially quite as vibrant and deeply as other fibers. It doesn't retain its color very long. Okay? Exposure to air, light, chemicals, and so forth speed the deterioration process. Now, this, I contend, is the reason why cotton patches were used. You can't dye linen very effectively, so what do? If you want to match the background of the cloth, I mean, it would seem reasonable that if you're going to patch this linen cloth, you would use a linen patch. Well, unfortunately, the linen wouldn't match the background color, so you had to turn around and dye it. And I contend that's why cotton, certainly linen was around and available. I think that's why cotton patches were used. It's also the reason why the original ink flaked off and the residuals show up as an iron background, a pervasive iron background all across the shroud and in the container. Okay, this is an iron-based ink. Now, I would also contend that the image must have been much more prominent in earlier times for two reasons. One, we know it was a tourist attraction. A lot of people were coming, pilgrims were coming into Luray and into that region of France to see it. And secondly, the artist, or whatever you want to call this person, had to see the progress of the work. So the image undoubtedly was much more vivid in earlier times than it is now. Okay? So the model that I'm describing here is that the shroud, since I've gone down this path, the shroud was printed with iron gall ink. The ink is corrosive. The ink corrodes the base fibers, either the base fibers or the retting or whatever was on the cloth before it was printed. And that's what we see as this very thin layer of discoloration. Now let me talk a little bit about the history of woodcuts. It's a technique of printing, as I said earlier, from planks of wood. You make a large plank of wood and you do a very shallow engraving on that plank and you ink it and you turn around and print it, much like a rubber stamp. It's one of the oldest methods in existence for making prints. It was used in China to decorate textiles since the 15th century. In Europe, printing, this article goes on to say that printing from wood blocks on textiles was known from the early 14th century, but it had little development until paper began to be manufactured in France and Germany at the end of the 14th century. Textile printing was known in Europe via the Islamic world from about the 12th century. So the technology to print was around for a while. Okay. Now, the last item on this thing is pretty remarkable as well. There's a thriving linen industry in Flanders from the 11th century on. Flanders, again, is right up the road. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. Until very recently, I've never saw it. And by the way, I should say this. This is a rather old idea. We were kicking this idea around. John Jackson and I had a conversation about it. We were kicking this idea around in 1978 about the possibility of this being a large block print. And one of the comments that was made was that it would really be hard to imagine that you could make something that big and that uniform. And the whole idea was dropped for a long time. About 5 years ago, I picked it back up again. This turns out to be a 15th century block print. Okay? It's a very large, very high resolution print of the city of Venice. You can see it. Now, the photograph, of course, doesn't do the object much justice because it's behind glass. And we were in line going through this museum, and didn't have a lot of opportunity to. Barry wasn't there. Didn't have a lot of opportunity to take good pictures, that sort of thing. But this is a very large 7-foot print, okay? And it has lots of gradations of grayscale in it. And it has quite a bit of resolution. Another example, I was floored about, is that this is in fact the block used to print the map of the world that was in circulation, what the world consisted of at that time. And you can see from the scale here, this is very large. These are blocks with the very fine engraving in them used for the printing process to make this map in repetitive form. So you can make large quantities of the map by taking this block, inking it, and then passing it around to your friends and whoever else might desire a map of this size. Now, the wounds in the wrists. This is the only other example that I've ever found, okay, looking all over, including the Museum of Religious Art in Dallas, of an example where we see the wounds in the wrists rather than the hands. You can see it here. This is a church in Regensburg, Germany, okay? And again, we were running back to the boat at this particular time, and I didn't get the name of the church. But I did look into it. I actually wrote a letter, but I never got an answer as to which church, what's the name of this church. It turns out that looking through the annals of history a little bit about Regensburg is that Regensburg has some of the oldest churches in Europe, some of them going back to the 7th century. So there is another example, and again, I can't quote when this thing was created, but somebody else knew about the fact that the wounds had to be in the wrists and not the hands. Lastly, a point about iron gall ink being corrosive. Okay, this is an excerpt I pulled out of an article, and I've emphasized the important sentence in this whole thing is that iron gall ink corrosion of paper is one of the largest threats for our graphic patrimony. A great deal of work is done in this field to explain the possible mechanism. Basically, document preservationists make their living by trying to save documents from themselves. Because iron gall ink is corrosive, iron gall ink eventually eats through the paper. So I contend this is the mechanism by which the cellulose on the very top surface of the cloth was either degraded specifically or whatever other chemicals might have been present were reacted with by this ink. Now, there are many, many different recipes for iron gall ink, so it's not possible to really specify what the chemical composition might be because, at that time there was a lot of artists around and every artist had his own little unique formula for making stuff. But the main component is the iron gall, and of course it has a major component of iron in it naturally, and it is also reactive. Now, let me say a word about the 3D characteristics. These are earlier images, and these are actually the original images before any filtering was done. You can make these look a lot better if you use digital filtering, and you've seen examples of that yesterday. So the question is, do you get a 3D image out of this sort of process? And I would contend, yes, you do. And the reason is the following. Points of high relief, okay, when they're inked and transferred to a cloth surface, create higher density areas. It's kind of like a halftone process. It isn't quite. It's basically the small limit of a halftone process. All the other theories, by the way, about have problems with it. There's the issue of cloth contact points that we're talking about. Things. There's the issue of folding distortions. There's the issue of front to back smearing. You actually try to wrap the body in a cloth like that and somehow create the image. Of course, the back image, you would think, the first one supposed to be
Microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. I lost it there for a second. There's the issue of cloth contact points, the issue of folding distortion, the issue of front to back smearing, and the issue of high fidelity radiative transfer, and I'll talk about that in a second. Anyways, I've indicated on this chart up here the three different sorts of geometries that have been speculated on or conjectured in the past about how the image was transferred and the geometry of the drape. There's one case where it's very tightly wrapped. The second case where up here showed where there's a sort of loose drape. And the third case where in some sort of radiative process, it's transferred to a reference plane somehow. I looked at that one in some detail, that last case. And I'll show you the results here shortly. So anyways, let's get back to the business of transferring ink. Now, these points of very high pressure transfer, because the pressure is high, lots of ink, okay? The points of very shallow relief transfer low, don't transfer much ink. So the ink density is low. So you can see that the higher the object is and the more pointed it is, the more ink transferred. So I claim out of this process one gets a pseudo three-dimensional property. Now these are calculations that I did using bidirectional reflectance distribution functions, and this is a technique that uses in optics to try to determine what an image would look like radiating from an object. I could not duplicate in this section. This heavy line here is actually the bridge of the nose. I did some radiative calculations to see if I could duplicate that by any radiative transfer, including using the 1 over r squared law and a number of different distributions here from each object point, and I could not duplicate this. Okay? I concluded from this, at least, that there is a fairly good support, at least from this limited analysis, that the image, in fact, is a contact print, not a radiative transfer process. The last comment I'll make is this is Flanders up here. This is Luray. It's right up the road, probably within 100 kilometers or so, and this is the center of a lot of linen production and linen printing. Okay? I'm not going to talk about authenticity. I think you know all about that. I'll get to the conclusion. I guess I'm running out of time, am I? Yeah, good. All right, so the confluence of historical and social circumstances, together with the scientific data and the visual observations, make a plausible case for a 14th century shroud using techniques that were in existence in the 14th century. So thank you. Do I get the award or not?